How you guys doing this afternoon? This evening, it's actually February 24th, lovely Sunday evening. Got my trusty little coffee cup here. I decided that I want to go ahead and record chapter 20 to let you guys have this because I know that we're going to be off for Friday, and I know that we're a little behind as far as the blood vessels are concerned, but I wanted to kind of make this recording for chapter 20, the lymphatic system, um, in the since I'm going to be gone on Friday for my convention in Houston. So this is kind of our first recording, so bear with me. This is kind of my first go around with a recording like this. So what I want to do first and foremost is show you the slide here, walk you through this, and exactly like we've been doing in a lecture per se, with the exception that it's going to be a recording. So hopefully this works out. We'll see how this turns out. Hopefully you find this very informative and that it helps you out this weekend or even Friday or this week when you start recording, or excuse me, opening this up and looking at the recording. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to go ahead and X out of the camera and go from here. Okay, so just bear with me here. Okay, so here's chapter 20, where we'll be talking about the lymphatic system. That also includes the lymphoid organs and the tissues. So that's all encompassing as far as one system there. So here's our lymphatic system. This is our functions of it, right? Lymphatic system main function is to return fluids leak from the blood vessels back to the blood, and it's got three parts here. What I'm going ahead and going to do here for you guys is kind of highlight some things as I'm talking about them. I might write a couple notes. I'm using a mouse here, so the mouse can tend to be kind of hard to manage per se, but I will be highlighting some stuff here as I'm talking. Okay, so fluids leak back from blood vessels, right, back to blood. So we're talking about fluids, and in fact, we're looking at fluids from where? So we're talking about fluids from the interstitial fluids that are bathing in cells, right? So what is it consisting of, right? We've got number one, lymphatic vessels, okay? So we got lymphatic vessels. We also have lymph, number two. That's what we consider the fluid in blood vessels, number two there. And number three, lymph nodes, right? And these lymph nodes are actually little aggregates of lymphatic tissue that we're going to see in just a second. But their main function is to cleanse the lymph. Cleanse the lymph of what? We've got several different things that can go into lymph, but one being, of course, the lymph fluid, right? Okay. And of course, we've got the lymphoid organs and tissues. That's part of the lymphatic system. That is also considered then the structures that are part of the lymphatic system. Okay. Of course, you've got the spleen. That's part of that. The thymus, tonsils, lymphoid nodules, and those. So here's our main function of the lymphatic system. Again, interstitial fluid. That's the fluid that they're discussing there. That fluid comes from the blood and also the leaked plasma proteins, which come to blood, or come from blood, excuse me. And so we take that stuff, we take the lymphatic fluid and the plasma proteins via a system that we call the lymphatic vessels. These are your drainage vessels. And lo and behold, it's about 3 liters of interstitial fluid per day that gets cleansed. Once that fluid enters the lymphatics, if you will, it's called lymph. So that's why we use the word lymph to describe lymphatic fluid, right? Okay. Lymphatic vessels are really a one-way system. Okay, so that's a key word to understand because we're talking about a one-way system, right? It does not go two ways. Okay, once the lymph flows from the interstitial fluid, it's going to flow towards the heart, one-way system. Okay. So when we talk about vessels, we are discussing capillaries and larger vessels, right? So we use the same exact word that you would describe using blood vessels, and in fact, we talk about those being capillaries, smallest blood vessels that we have, but we also use that word synonymously with the lymphatic system. We talk about the smallest lymph vessels being the lymphatic capillaries. Okay, so what are the lymphatic capillaries then? We use the term blind-ended, okay, to discuss the structure of the vessel at the very end, or you could argue at the very beginning of these vessels, and we talk about those being blind-ended. So I'll come back to that word blind-ended in just a second. Okay, so these vessels initially are found between cells and blood capillaries. That's where you're going to find lymphatic capillaries, right? So right interweaved between the blood capillaries is where you're going to have the blind-ended vessels, right? So instead of talking about where you find these capillaries, we describe here where you don't find them. And so bones, teeth, and bone marrow do not have lymphatic capillaries, and pretty much everywhere else, including even the cerebral spinal fluid and the central nervous system. So we think that we have those in the meninges, and we've begun to discover that pretty recently. Okay, so some similarities that we talk about here when we compare lymphatic capillaries to blood vessels, and some differences as well. But as far as their similarities, structurally almost exactly the same, but they are more permeable, which means they do allow for more intake of things into the capillary itself. So that's a big difference between blood capillaries and lymphatic capillaries. They can actually, because they're more permeable, they can actually take up larger molecules and particles, right? So bigger molecules, chemical molecules, can be taken up by the lymphatic capillaries versus the blood capillaries, right? And so we give you examples of those, okay? We've got proteins, cell debris, pathogens, and cancer cells, right? All act as those larger molecules. And if you look at proteins, some are quite large, right? And unfortunately, when we look at cancer, talking about cancer, unfortunately, the cancer cells can migrate through the lymphatic capillaries into the lymph node, and so we see this occurring in cancer when cancer does spread. So it can spread to other parts of the body via the lymphatic capillaries. And so this is figure 20.1a. Good figure to look at when you're first looking at where these lymphatic capillaries are found amongst the cardiovascular system and the blood vessels. And so when you look at this, make sure that you can look or really look at the bottom square, the bottom descriptive box here that shows you the lymphatic capillaries and how they're interweaved into the blood capillaries found right in the tissue bed, right? So they are taking up, as you can see in these black arrows, they're taking up the interstitial fluid. The interstitial fluid that would leak out of blood capillaries, sending in the nutrients and the oxygen to cells. And in that same regard, you would find the waste and the carbon dioxide, for example, from cells. Well, this fluid itself is being taken up into the lymphatic capillaries. Now, as it enters into the lymphatic capillaries, this fluid, which is basically plasma from the blood capillaries, now becomes lymph. We use the word lymph to describe this type of fluid, and that's really based on location. Okay. So talking again about permeability, just kind of discussing that there, permeability. Okay. Because they have increased permeability, it's really because of two of these types of anatomical structure capabilities, right? Number one, the endothelial cells, right? Endothelial cells in a lymphatic capillary actually overlap each other, and they actually become what we know to be mini valves, right? And a mini valve is actually just a kind of where the two endothelial cells overlap, forming a gap to allow then fluid to enter into the lymphatic capillaries. And we'll see that in just a second. There'll be a figure here to show you in just a second what that looks like. These mini valves, in fact, are anchored by collagen. Okay, that collagen anchors it to the matrix, and so it increases the extracellular volume, extracellular fluid volume when it opens those valves, and it makes those valves open up even more. Okay. So when we have extra flow, extra volume, those mini valves actually open up. And as we lose the volume, as the volume decreases, we actually cause those mini valves to close. Okay. Before we move on, let me talk about lacteals. Lacteals are a special capillary system, and we find that in intestinal mucosa, right? Intestinal mucosa. Intestinal mucosa is very interesting because intestinal mucosa is the lining of the intestinal or GI tract. Okay, very interesting to note here because these lacteals actually help to take in fats from the digestion, from our nutrition, the food that we eat. Here's how we actually take up the fat. So we don't take it up in blood vessels. We actually take it up in what we call lymph. Into the lymph fluid through these lacteals. So they're very interesting to note because they actually help to bring in fat and then help to digest that fat. Okay. So here's a figure 20.1b. Okay, is a figure that describes visually how these mini flaps look like, right? And so you see several mini flaps. One is circled. I'll circle that circle right there. There's another mini flap there, and another mini flap there. And then, of course, there's the fourth one there, right? 4 mini flaps there, okay? Those 4 mini flaps are anchored by collagen, and you can see those nice little long lines being the collagen fibers connected to the matrix. So they're anchored to connective tissue. You know that connective tissue is made up of matrix, and so it's connected there as well, okay? And so you see that there. So when fluid is increased around that area outside of the capillary, those valves kind of open up a little bit more, allowing more fluid to go into the capillaries. And then when fluid decreases, it causes those flaps to shut down. That's really how the system works as far as how much fluid gets entered into the lymph capillaries and how much does not. Okay, so moving on past the capillaries, we talk about the larger lymphatic vessels. And so all these capillaries, as is very similar to the blood vessel system, smaller capillaries lead to larger vessels, and in the same regard, the lymphatic system is exactly the same way. Okay, so the capillaries actually drain into larger vessels, and we call those larger vessels collecting lymphatic vessels, right? Those are consisting of collecting vessels, the trunks, and the ducts. All 3 of those fall into this group we call collecting lymphatic vessels. Okay, very similar to veins, more so than even arteries. So they're not very similar to arteries, or more similar to blood vessels, and those type of blood vessels being veins is really what they're more similar to. Okay, in that regard, those vessels are similar to veins in the fact that they have thinner walls, right? They have more valves, more internal valves, so thinner walls and more internal valves. And they anastomose more frequently. And what does that word mean, anastomose? This is actually, again, we use that same word as we do in the blood vessel system, in the fact that these lymphatic vessels connect to each other in different ways, right? So they form this networking of connections apart from the main vessel that carries the fluid. So they astomose more frequently. So you'll have more of these interconnecting network system there. Okay. All right. So talking about trunks, here's our trunks here, right? Okay. The largest collecting vessels kind of form what we call lymphatic trunks, right? And there are 5 major ones here that we're going to mention, right? So they're mentioned by the region. So the location of what region they're draining is where you find these, okay? So lumbar, so there's one on each side, so that's why there's a pair. Bronchiomediastinal, subclavian, jugular trunk, and intestinal trunk. Okay, found for the region, and again, you got to go back to your regions, but found for the region where this fluid actually drains from. All right, so all these collecting vessels, actually all the capillaries and the collecting vessels become a trunk, and all that fluid is coming from a region. That's how we name these trunks for that region. Okay. Those trunks actually all become two actually big ducts. Okay, so this is the major vessel of the lymphatic system, and this is actually where all the lymph actually leads up to. Right, two large ducts. First one is the right lymphatic duct. Okay, that drains the right upper arm and the right side of the head and thorax. So make sure that you understand, you know, where the right lymphatic duct drains from. Okay, the right upper arm and the right side of the head and thorax. The thoracic duct, okay, drains the rest of the body that is not the right upper arm. Excuse me. Sorry about my highlighting there. Rest of the body that's not the right upper arm or not the right side of the head and thorax. Okay. In just a second, let me do a little eraser magic here. Okay, thoracic duct, right? Rest of the body beside the right upper arm and right side of the head and thorax, right? Okay. So where do they drain to eventually? Where do these two ducts drain to? Well, they actually drain, in fact, between the jugular and the subclavian vein on each side of the body. So between the right jugular and the right subclavian is where you're going to have the right lymphatic duct drain to, and between the left jugular and left subclavian is where you're going to have the thoracic duct drain to. And so you actually see this here, okay? Although it is a little tough to look at here, I'm going to try to highlight it for you, the area that they're discussing. But right here you have on the left side between the right jugular, the left jugular and the left subclavian, this point right here is where you're going to have then the thoracic duct drain to, okay? And on this left side here, on the right side here, the right side of the body, you have then your right jugular and right subclavian, and right at this point right here is where the right lymphatic duct actually drains its lymph from. Okay, so those two portions of the body are where the lymph actually goes back into the bloodstream. Okay, and obviously you can see that both of those of which actually end up being draining all that and blood into the superior vena cava, right? So the superior vena cava drains both of those there, right? So that fluid actually goes into the right part of the heart, through the heart itself, into the lungs, and then back from the lungs into the left side of the heart, and then into systemic circulation after the heart, right? Okay, so here's a lymphatic system, figure 20.3, entire lymphatic system is what you see here. and you see all of the lymphatic vessels and what we call the lymphatic nodes, right? So we'll talk about those here very shortly. Okay, before we get into that, I want to talk about lymphangitis. And lymphangitis is a condition that you actually can view from the external part of the body. And you see this here because the lymphatic vessels look like painful red lines under the skin. And that is a condition that we have because we have inflammation, right? Inflammation of the vessels, right? Okay, so we have this issue, for example, when we've got conditions that have inflammation setting in, and that inflammation itself can cause this red vessel to be seen the outside of the skin. Okay. All right, so let's talk about lymph. We've been talking about lymph, so lymph's kind of where we're at so far. And so when we talk about lymph, the lymphatic system is actually a low pressure system, very similar to the vein system or the venous system of the cardiovascular system. And they're propelled. The lymph is taken. Propelled means transported, right? Propelled. Okay, by the same mechanisms as then the veins, right? And so when we see the veins themselves, excuse me, grabbing some coffee there. When we see veins themselves, we know that the skeletal muscles, for example, when contracted, cause then pressure to be pushed against the vessel itself, causing then, for example, blood, deoxygenated blood, if this was the vein system, or lymph, if it's the lymphatic vessels, to be shot up, okay, through the body or into the body, up the body, for example, towards then those two ducts, right? And so we see this what we call milking action, right? Milking action, okay? This milking action is actually the skeletal muscles pushing against the wall of the lymphatic vessel, causing this, fluid to go back up, right? Pressure changes in the thorax when we breathe, okay, can cause then those major vessels and the major ducts to deposit or bring the actual fluid into the heart itself. They also have valves, okay, so as in the same regard as the vein system, valves as well. Arteries themselves, okay, so when the arteries move or moving blood through themselves, we call this pulsation, can actually cause then the nearby, the vessel, the lymphatic vessel next to it to move its fluid through as well. And finally, the smooth muscle in lymphatics and the lymph vessels also do assist in moving that fluid up as well. Okay. Okay, lymphedema. Let's talk about that, right? Lymphedema, severe localized edema. Okay, so swelling, if you will, right? Another way to say swelling. So a lot of swelling going on. That swelling is because of the increase of lymph in that area, right? That lymph has actually caused the swelling of these vessels in that area, and because of that, we get this swelling that you see on the outside of the body that we would call edema, right? Edema. So why do you have this? Why would somebody have this? There's some examples here. Tumors can cause that as well. Taking out the lymphatic vessels, if you will, during cancer, because of cancer. And so if there is a tissue or we find cancer in the lymphatic system, then we want to remove those vessels, and we would elect to do that. And because of that, we've got edema setting in. And that is really because there is no lymphatic vessels there to actually pick up that lymph fluid. And so sometimes we can have lymphatic pathways emerging. Those anastomosis can actually continue to connect, and so we have new connections there that can actually assist with the flow as well. Okay, so we're in 20.2. So if you're in comparison to your book, 20.2, the lymphoid cells, tissues, and organs. This is kind of where we're at here. Okay, so let's talk about the cells of the lymphoid system. Now, these are immune system cells, and these immune system cells are really going to be found in the lymphatic system, but also in the bloodstream, but more so in the lymphatic system. This is really a crucial part to discuss, because we really talk about this flow going in, this plasma that becomes part of the interstitial fluid, that interstitial fluid being taken up by the lymphatic system and now called lymph. But we really want to discuss, why is that the case? Why do we have this system in place in our body, and why in fact does it have to work this way? And that answer really is because what we see here, the lymphoid cells. Okay, that's really the immune system cells. Okay, and I'll underline that. Immune system cells that you find in lymphoid tissue, and the supporting cells that form this lymphoid tissue structure. Okay, so number one, here's the really important, kind of tying what we talk about in the lymphatic system, what we call lymphocytes, right? And those are the lymphocytes, the same exact lymphocytes that you find in the blood chapter, in the cardiovascular system, when we talk about these white blood cells, and the last section of white blood cells that we call lymphocytes. And there's actually two different types, T cell and B cells, right? T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes, both of which are really important for adaptive immunity, okay, which I will kind of expand on here, right? And so when we look at B and T cells, right, they protect us against what we call antigens. Antigens are any kind of chemical structure, any kind of chemical component that we find in the body that our body perceives as foreign. And so these T and B lymphocytes will actually run into these antigens, okay? And because they run into these antigens, when they hit the surface of the B and T lymphocyte, they will recognize them as foreign, and they will mount a response, in fact, to destroy those antigens. Now, what do we look at, or what can be described, if you will, as an antigen? Well, in the examples here, they talk about bacteria being one of them, viruses being another one, but also sometimes when we talk about toxins, be any kind of form of toxin that the body perceives as foreign and can harm us, the B and T lymphocytes can actually recognize those and put a stop to those toxins from damaging our body even further. And the same regard can be talked about when you talk about bacteria and viruses. Red blood cells, so when they're mismatched, for example, when there is an incomparability, when we have different blood types being mixed, this is what can happen. And cancer cells. And in fact, I tell everybody that everybody has had cancer once in their life. And so when I make that statement, people kind of step back a little bit and say, everybody's had cancer? Yeah, everybody's had cancer before. Those cells have actually grown out of control. But the good thing is those B and T lymphocytes help to actually put a stop to those. It recognizes cells that are not acting correctly. And because they're not acting correctly, they actually can recognize those and can actually destroy them, which is great for our body, because most of the time those cancer cells get eliminated before they cause harm. It's the ones that actually hide from the immune system, these B and T lymphocytes, in fact, are the cancers that we see in our family members and our friends, that when they say they have cancer, these are the ones that have actually developed, because of the mutation, a way to run away or hide away from the B and T lymphocytes. The B and T lymphocytes cannot recognize them. Because they can't recognize them, they cannot do their job. And so that's what we see when we see cancer. But normally speaking, our body does have mutated cells that grow out of control. And normally speaking, the B and T lymphocytes would take care of them. Okay. So what do T cells do? We're not talking about the immune system yet, but this is immunity definitely. So we need to talk about this. But there's their main function, right? Manage the immune response, right? There are the managers of the immune response. So they manage how the threat is going to be dealt with, who's going to deal with it. We're talking about who, meaning cells, and how big of a threat or how big of a response, excuse me, that can be turned on to attack the particular antigen, right? T cells also participate very slightly in the destroying of the antigen, but they're the managers, mainly. Talking about the ones that actually do the destroying, do the action, is the B cells. B cells actually, when presented the antigen, will actually make what we call plasma cells. They'll differentiate, they'll change into plasma cells, and they'll actually undergo a rapid mitosis and produce these B cells. Excuse me, these plasma cells, and these plasma cells will then, in fact, when multiplied, produce many antibodies. Antibodies help to trap the antigen. They also mark the antigen for destruction, and phagocytes, or other white blood cells, can actually do the destroying. Okay. So we have other lymphoid cells, right? Immune system cells, one being macrophages, right? So macrophages are part of the lymphatic system, and you actually find macrophages in the lymphoid tissue, okay, and in the lymphoid vessels, right? They're the ones that phagocytize, so they undergo phagocytosis. They help activate the T cells, which are really important, so they actually turn on other T cells to do their job. Dendritic cells capture the antigens, and they actually deliver them to the lymph nodes. And we'll talk about lymph nodes in just a second, but lymph nodes, in fact, are really important places that you find the B and T lymphocytes. Okay. The reticular cells actually produce reticular fibers that we call stroma. Okay, you find those in the lymphoid organs. These act as scaffolding areas for the lymphoid organs, and so you find these also present in lymph nodes as well. So here, figure 20.4, you actually find a picture of the reticular connective tissue, and we find this in a lymph node. Okay, we find this in a lymph node, and you can see the lymph node here, in fact. So there's a couple things to kind of look at here, and I'll kind of change the color of the pin here, but one being a macrophage, right? There's our typical macrophage hanging out in reticular connective tissue, and we find this in the lymph node hanging out there. And this is really what you see in a lymph node. You see a bunch of reticular fibers, right? These long kind of blue lines, and I'll kind of change the color here to show you these long kind of blue lines, which are reticular fibers kind of strung around everywhere, okay, that are part of a lymph node, and physically hanging on the actual reticular fibers are these then macrophages, right? These macrophages are there to actually patrol the fluid, because in between this kind of empty space, we have the fluid, lymph fluid, going through from the vessels into these lymph nodes, and on and on and on. So you see these many lymph nodes there going on its way to the actual ducts, right? So the fluid goes through these lymph nodes, and hanging out in the macrophages, the lymphocytes, B and T lymphocytes, and they're patrolling. They are there hanging out, looking at the fluid, ready for one of those antigens to hit them, their own body, their own cell. Once those cells get hit, then they trap them there, and this is a way to actually, as for example, like a border patrol station or a checkpoint station, and this would be a road, the road being the lymphatic vessel, and the border patrol station kind of just checks and checks who's the right person that can pass through, and this is what we're seeing here. That's in fact, generally speaking, and simply how this lymphatic system works. It's a housing area for the immune system to actually patrol and then attack the threat, because keep in mind, we're going to have these bacteria, these viruses, these toxins, anything that proceeds as a antigen being found in cells that got invaded by it. Maybe that might be the skin level, or it might be found in blood. Maybe these antigens might be found in blood, but both of which this fluid itself comes from those areas, and because it comes from those areas, we're hitting it right there. We're getting that information from those places. And so, in fact, we're getting it from all parts of the body, because lymphatic capillaries, lymphatic vessels, lymphatic system can be found in all these places. So that's why it's really interesting to note why they're found everywhere. Okay, really, really interesting stuff. Okay, so here's the function of the lymphoid tissues, right? Houses, there's a patrolling site, right? But also proliferation site, right? This is where lymph nodes can actually proliferate, can actually make more of themselves, right? Here's the surveillance, right? Here's our little patrolling surveillance area, like a checkpoint station, surveying the fluid as it goes by, surveying what's happening there. So very interesting to note that the lymphocytes and the macrophages, when I was talking about hanging out there, they actually do hang as a surveillance point, which is, I think, is really interesting that the body has this, right? So when we look at lymphoid tissue, it's made up of reticular connective tissue. And again, that's the reticular fibers there. This is loose connective tissue. If you remember your connective tissues, it's actually loose connective tissue. Not dense, because it would be dense. It would not allow these white blood cells, these B and T lymphocytes and the macrophages to migrate through. So it's got to be loose so that way they can actually migrate through that area, right? Okay, so there's two types of lymphoid tissue: diffuse, right? Okay, diffuse, that's the lymphoid cells, and then some reticular fibers. You find that every body organ practically, okay? So you find that there. And then what we call lymphoid follicles, right? Which are these nodules, right? These packed lymphoid cells and reticular fibers, right? Okay. So we find these aggregations, these really dense places where we got lymphoid cells and reticular fibers, and you usually find these, for example, in what we call Peyer's patches. And we're going to see Peyer's patches in just a bit in this recording, in this PowerPoint, and the appendix. So we find these real dense, aggregated areas where we're going to have a lot of packed lymphoid cells, B and T lymphocytes, and the reticular fibers. Interesting to note that this is a germinal center for B cells that actually create a bunch of plasma cells. So it's a nice area for them to kind of, make more of themselves. And it's a nice area to actually be presented with antigens. So that's important for the immune system because we need to make more of them. And the Peyer's patches, you'll see in just a second, and it'll make a lot more sense where they're found, because you can find a portal of entry, a place where things can go into the bloodstream really easily or into our body, where you find the Peyer's patches. So I think it's pretty interesting. And the appendix. It's part of, by the way, it's part of another system of the body. So if you know where that's at, that's kind of, ties it in really well. Okay. So we basically classify lymphoid organs into two places. If you're a primary lymphoid organ or you're a secondary lymphoid organ. Okay? If you're a primary lymphoid organ, you'll find this is a place where you mature your B and T lymphocytes, and the primary lymphoid organs are your red bone marrow and your thymus. So the two places that are considered primary lymphoid organs, where your B and T cells mature. Okay, so that's the key word. Maturing area for B and T lymphocytes, red bone marrow, thymus, that's where those are at, right? Both the B, and I'll highlight this so that way you, just give me a second here, you'll highlight this. B and T lymphocytes get made in the bone marrow. So again, bone marrow. Okay, this is a review of, where all blood cells come from, right? The bone marrow. So B and T cells, those are the lymphoid cells, right? But B cells mature in the bone marrow, and T cells mature in the thymus. Okay? Okay, so don't forget that. That's really important. B and T cells, like all blood cells, in the red bone marrow. But B cells mature in the bone marrow. T cells mature in the thymus. Okay? Both of which are primary lymphoid organs. The red bone marrow and the thymus are both primary lymphoid organs. So that's how you gotta have to work through it to understand this correctly. Okay? And your secondary lymphoid organs are where the mature lymphocytes first encounter the antigen. Okay, here's where they become activated. Okay, so I like to think of the lymphoid cells as our little, and all your white blood cells and all your immune system cells as our military. Okay, as our law enforcement for our body. They're made in the bone marrow, and they're taken, some of them, like the T cells, are taken to the thymus, and the B cells stay in the red bone marrow. And this is a place where they're going through, let's say, military school, okay, basic training, or if these are police, this would be the police academy, where they learn how to actually do their job. Okay, very simply. After such points, when they mature, they're sent to, or given their orders, or their station to where they're going to report. Okay, and here's where they start reporting, in the secondary lymphoid organs. That's kind of what we're talking about here. This is where the mature lymphocytes go and actually do their job. Okay, and what's their job? To encounter an antigen. Okay, encounter an antigen, become activated, and then eliminate the threat, whatever that threat might be. That antigen, in fact, is the threat. Now that antigen, that chemical, can be attached to, let's say, the cell wall of a bacteria or the outside surface of a virus. And so the lymphoid cells don't care if it's attached to a cell, if it's attached by itself, or what it is, but it just knows that it's going to eliminate the threat. And that's what it's going to try to do. Where do you find secondary lymphoid organs? List here for you, right? No, the lymph nodes are the secondary lymphoid organs. The spleen, what we call malts, like malt shake, but malts, right? Mucoid associated lymphoid tissues, which, you know what that stands for. And then what we call diffuse lymphoid tissues, right? Where you find those areas. Okay, so let's talk about the lymph nodes, right? Those are your secondary lymphoid organs, right? There are hundreds, literally hundreds of nodes found throughout the body. Deep connective tissue is where you're going to find that, you know, embedded into. And then you've got these, you know, small lymphatic vessels that lead to each lymph node, right? So deeper tissue is where we're going to find these lymph nodes, with the exception of these places, right? So the inguinal region, the axillary region, cervical regions of the body. So those are nearer to the body surface, right? So looking at this figure again from 20.3, you see then the lymphatic system, right? You see the veins, right? The jugular veins there, and how these ducts feed the lymph into those veins, and then you also see all the lymphatic vessels, and then you also see the lymph nodes, so scattered everywhere. There are a lot of collections of lymph nodes, and the collection of lymph nodes really close together, we usually name them for the region, right? So let me point this one out to you, right? Axillary nodes, right? Where aggregation of these lymph nodes can be found in these areas of the body. The axillary region is a, you know, nice way to put, you know, to name the armpit, right? Armpit area. Now, looking at that, I want you to take some time kind of looking at this. You can pause it if you want at this point when I ask this question to kind of think through it. because I want to get you to think through things like we do in class. Same thing, is to kind of get you through this area to kind of talk about this area right here, the axillary nodes. Now, why would the body itself have this aggregation of these nodes in this area, in the armpit? Okay, so I want you to pause it if you can. Pause the recording and kind of think through that question. Try to think of the answer why it would be there in that area. On top of that, before you pause it, think of this question, see if this helps you. Why, in fact, would you have nodes, if you will, in the cervical region? Look at that there. Okay, so the question now is basically, why would you have this collection of lymph nodes kind of aggregated together in the axillary region, the cervical region, and even if you look at the inguinal, the groin region? Okay, so pause it, think about it, and I'll give you the answer here. Right? And so the answer basically is that in these areas, these could be the areas that are found, okay, as portals of entry, where skin basically is really close together, where you have a perfect storm of conditions that are perfect for the growth of bacteria, viruses, and things like that. So these areas have moisture, have a right amount of temperature, and have a wonderful amount of nutrients in these areas, because of which we can have a potential growth of bad things like bacteria or viruses entering into these areas. And because of that, what we call a portal of entry, place where these foreign things get into, like bacteria, we've got a bunch of these nodes located in these areas that are put there to act as an extra barrier in these areas. So that's really what the answer is. Okay, so what are the functions of lymph nodes, right? They act as filters, right? They filter the lymph, and in fact they filter the fluid of the tissue bed, and actually that fluid coming from the blood, it actually is a place to filter all of that, right? Macrophages that are found in lymph nodes, right? Remove, destroy microorganisms, right? Kill them. Okay, that might be in that fluid. Debris that enters there, maybe cellular debris, right? Be anything. What we want is to take away unwanted substances going back into blood. We don't want that in blood. So what would we want to do? Clean that out, right? So helps to do that. How we activate the immune system. Great function, right? Activating the immune system is really important. When we activate the immune system, we can fight infections better. We can fight things like that better. Okay, so looking at the structure of a lymph node, they can vary in size and shape. Most are bean shaped. Shows you a little bit about less than an inch. Okay, so you know that's pretty big size. Okay, we've got a capsule, so it's fibrous connective tissue. There's a capsule there as well, and so those fibers actually invade or intersect, if you will, in the lymph node itself. And so they divide the node into different compartments. We're going to see the picture in just a second, the figure in just a second to show you that. And so there's two regions of the node. The inner region that we call the medulla, okay, and the outer region that we call the cortex, okay. Cortex, you would think of a cortex as a rind or bark on a tree, and that's really what the cortex is, the outside portion where the fibrous tissue is, and as you go inside slightly, that's still the cortex, and then deeper inside in the middle is what we call the medulla. We use these two terms, by the way, pretty interchangeably when we talk about different organs of different systems. For example, in the kidney, we talk about the cortex of the kidney and the cortex of the, or excuse me, the medulla of the kidney as well. So we use those words in other places. Okay, so in the cortex, what do you have there, right? In the cortex, we have what we know to be germinal centers, right? This is where you're going to have the B cells dividing. Germinal means germination, you know, making new things. And these are where the B cells make more B cells, undergo mitosis in the cortex, right? Germinal centers, okay? The deeper cortex, you have T cells that are actually in transit. They're moving in those areas, okay? Now, T cells will, on occasion, um, hang out in a node itself, but they also have the capability of going to other lymph nodes through the vessels as well. So they will, and this is random. It's not really a specific time that they hang out in a lymph node versus when they go to another lymph node. So it's random. Since we have many of them, they're randomly going to be, you know, in the lymph node and then be taken into circulation in the lymph to other lymph nodes. So that's really how they're working themselves, right? Okay. There are dendritic cells that you're going to find in the cortex. Those dendritic cells also undergo, they activate the T cells, and they also undergo phagocytosis sometimes, right? The medulla, okay, so this is deeper into the lymph node itself. You're going to have B cells, you're going to have T cells, and you're going to have what the B cells turn into, what we call plasma cells. Those plasma cells, don't forget from previously, we talked about how the B cells form plasma cells and how those plasma cells then synthesize, and secrete the antibodies. And they only do this when they're presented with an antigen. So when the antigen hits the B cell or the T cell and then activates those B cells turn into plasma cells. Those plasma cells, their main job, that's really all their job, is to produce tons and tons and tons of antibodies. And those flood everywhere, okay? All right, the sinuses, a sinus is an area that a vessel has that are found in these areas like a lymph node. These areas where these are where you're actually going to have the reticular fibers. In that figure that we just looked at a couple slides ago that showed the reticular fibers and the macrophages and the lymphocytes hanging out there, that's what we would call a sinus, that area there. Okay. So here's your typical lymph node. You've got your cortex area, right? The outside area. And the inner area that we call the medulla, right? Medulla. And this would be kind of, if I had to draw the area, let me draw that. This would be considered the medulla. Anything inside the red circle. And that's not exact, it's just kind of a range, but that's kind of what you would consider the medulla. And then everything kind of here would be the cortex, yeah? So that would be the cortex, if you will. Cortex, you have the germinal center, okay? And that's where you would find these T cells and the B cells rapidly dividing, entering into the medulla, right? The inner, where the sinus would be, where you find those reticular fibers located. Now notice something here really quick. So this is an important thing to kind of note here. This area here and this area here, you find the afferent lymphatic vessel or vessels, right? So afferent really means the incoming fluid. Okay, so that's where it's noted those black arrows going in, and the black arrows going out this way. We call the efferent or the exit vessels. So this is a one-way system. So we know that stuff comes in through the lymph node and then comes out through the lymph node. In and out, right? Afferent lymphatic vessels bring the fluid in. Efferent lymphatic vessels bring the fluid out or through the lymph node and out the lymph node. So interesting to note, afferent, efferent lymphatic vessels. Okay, so here's a photomicrograph of the lymph node, noting the lymphatic follicles, the cortex, the capsule. You see the capsule there, and then you see the internal medullary portion of the lymph node. Okay. All right. So afferent, efferent, right? In and out, right? So there's some anatomical terms here to note, but to show you that there is circulation, it's a one-way system. Okay. So again, there's your lymph node. All right. So a term that we call bulbils. Bulbils are a inflamed lymph node or lymph nodes. Okay. So this happens when the nodes are overwhelmed. What they're trying to destroy. This is a swelling of the lymph nodes. We would see as bulbils. So you can see this. You actually can see this in the external part of the body, from the outside of the body, as a swelled, localized area. Now we're not talking about an area, big area swelling. We're talking about the lymph node or lymph nodes swelling. So we'd see somewhat of a little bulge, if you will, that we call bulbils, right? So this is a swollen gland. For example, you would have a bulbo if you were having swollen lymph nodes in your mouth or in your lower part of your jaw, kind of in this area. If you look at where I'm pointing, kind of this area here, you have a bunch of lymph nodes there. Those are your cervical lymph nodes. And inflammation, if you have a mouth infection or throat infection or upper respiratory infection, you would have them swelled here. And so you would palpate or feel right there underneath the jaw. And if you'd feel those kind of swelled up, that's an indicator of inflammation, an indicator of infection, if you will. So you can have swollen glands there, or in every other places as well, right? When you look at the bubonic plague, so this is otherwise known as the plague, okay? One of the features of the plague is these bulbils, right? These real inflamed nodules or nodes, if you will, in these regional areas. So if it was a groin area and then in between your groin you have this big swelling, okay? You would see that as a sign of bubonic plague, or underneath your armpit, bubonic plague. This is clinical kind of feature, that's very closely associated with the disease itself. So interesting stuff. Okay. So when you have inflamed lymph nodes as well, can also be a sign of cancer. Just kind of an asterisk on the side. It's not always cancer. Could be an infection occurring. Could have this swelling happening. That is not cancerous. So those out there that are kind of trying to be one of those folks, kind of getting scared about what you hear in this class, not to be scared, but that can be a sign of cancer that's metastasizing, spreading via the lymph node to other places of the body. That's one of the signs that we see, signs, excuse me, that we see in cases of cancer where it's spreading. We see the inflammation of the lymph nodes. Okay, let's talk about the spleen. Okay, the spleen is a very blood-rich organ. It's very vascularized. There's a lot of blood vessels in the spleen itself. Okay, it's located on the left side, abdominal cavity, just below the stomach. In fact, it's our largest lymphoid organ. Okay, since it has a ton of blood vessels feeding it, it has two main arteries and veins. We call these the splenic. Let me highlight that for you. Splenic artery and vein. Okay, splenic artery and vein. They enter a location called the hilum, and so we use this word interchangeably between the spleen, the kidney, and even the lymph node. We call this the hilum, where the entry point to some vessels can be found. Right. So what's the main function of a spleen? Right. Lymphocyte proliferation, place where, in fact, we make and lymphatic cells, and how we surveillance the immune system and how we respond. Not the immune system, but we surveillance the lymphoid lymph tissue and the lymph fluid, and actually how we actually respond to them, right? So this is where you would find a main function of the spleen, right? It's also a place where we break down blood cells and platelets, and the macrophages actually are very much, excuse me, of garbage disposal. So macrophages not only participate in the immune system, but old, worn out blood cells like white blood cells, lymphocytes that have kind of worn themselves out. This is a place where they get recycled, broken down by the macrophages. The macrophages will break them down, destroy them, send the debris out to be kind of taken to the digestive system and then taken out through feces. That's really what we see here. Okay, just to kind of recap, we saw this figure already, figure 20.5, but just to kind of show you again, this figure, because it shows you where, of course, the spleen will be located, right? Just below the stomach on the right side of the body. There it is, right there. See the spleen, place where you find that, right? So you see that there. There's the hilum. There's a location where the arteries and veins enter from. Splenic artery, splenic vein. Two major artery vein that enter and exit the spleen there. And that's the hilum. We'll take a look at that. There's where there's a cadaver, right? Actually a human body that we use for study, and this is where you see the spleen. Right next to the kidney, there's the adrenal gland, there's the kidney, and then you see the pancreas there. There's the diaphragm. Located directly left of that would be the stomach. You just don't see it there in the picture. Okay, so here's another three functions of the spleen, right? Stores breakdown products of red blood cells for later reuse, and in particular, here's where a place in the body that we store iron, right? Remember, they are erythrocytes, red blood cells, 110, 90 to 120 days is their life cycle. After they've worn out their use, is where they get, we break them down. A place where we store iron is the spleen. Another place that we store iron is the liver, of course, but here's where we store iron. We can reuse the iron. The other stuff we don't really reuse per se, but the iron we can. So this is a place where we store it. Where we store platelets, okay, as well in the spleen, and monocytes. Okay, monocytes are a white blood cell, right? Monocytes. And it's also a place where we have erythrocyte production in the fetus. It's actually where we make red blood cells in the fetus itself. Okay, so when we look at the cells of the spleen, it actually has two places, what we call the red pulp, the white pulp, and the red pulp, which we're going to talk about here. Okay. Okay. So the white pulp is where immune function occurs. Okay. So that's kind of where we have immune function, right? So mostly lymphocytes on reticular fibers. White pulp clusters are where you're going to find these areas, and we call them white pulp because it's going to where there's going to be an aggregation, a collection of a bunch of lymphocytes hanging on those reticular fibers. So they're found around a central artery. Okay, so this is where you find those lymphocytes. And in red pulp is an area in the spleen where you're going to find old red blood cells and old white blood cells. And this is where the destruction of those and pathogens happen, right? So those macrophages, in fact, are found there in good amounts. And this is where we're going to destroy not only the old blood cells, but the pathogens as well. Okay, so this picture itself, right? Excuse me, this picture itself shows the spleen itself and shows the red pulp and the white pulp. You can see the red pulp, this pinkish kind of tissue there that you find in the spleen, and in between, or right in the middle of the red pulp, you have the white pulp, right? So you can see it. I'm trying to find a color here that's appropriate to use with all this other blue and red, but That area basically there is your white pulp. Okay. All right. So here's a photomicrograph. Here's a specimen photograph here showing you in fact the spleen itself, and you see the capsule, right? That's the outside portion of the spleen. Internally, you see the this circle area where you have the white pulp amongst the area all through here that we would be the red pulp all through here. Okay. All right. So sometimes we have spleens that rupture, and that does happen in healthcare. We do see this in patients as well. And there's several reasons why that might be the case. An infection can cause this, so depending on the type of infection, what type of blood-borne infection this might be, it can get so bad that it can actually cause the spleen to break open, the capsule to tear, and the spleen to break open. Because it's a highly vascularized tissue and organ, it can spill a lot of blood into the perineal cavity, into the actual cavity itself of the GI tract, and that can actually lead to worse infections and can actually lead to death. So it's a pretty serious kind of issue. But it also can happen from other things. Trauma can happen, severe blow to that area. Car accidents I've seen occur, and they see a spleen rupture. I've seen that before as well. And when those kind of situations happen, a lot of times they have to actually remove the spleen. Used to happen much more than now. It's actually a rarer occurrence to actually remove the spleen completely. What they actually do is they actually try to put that back together. That's the first kind of method of treatment, is to actually put that back together. But if it's destroyed enough, they can remove it completely. And in fact, a splenectomy is actually a removal of the spleen. But in fact, they want to keep it, right? They're going to try to keep that spleen intact as much as possible, because actually the spleen can repair itself, much like the liver can when damaged. The spleen can repair itself. So they try to, really keep that together intact, and lo and behold, after several weeks, the spleen can repair itself. Yeah. In the event the spleen does have to get removed, the liver mainly takes over the responsibility of the spleen, if that's going to be the situation. So we do have that occur as well. Okay, so it's not to say that your immune system goes down. It will go down, but other tissues like the liver will take up the job of the spleen and will do a good job. And so your immune system will still continue to be the immune system. So it still has, it does have an effect in short term. Long term, your immune system still is the immune system. So, pretty interesting things. Amazing how the body kind of works, right? So let's revisit malt, or talk about that, because I mentioned that earlier in the PowerPoint, but I didn't discuss it, and I told you I would discuss it. So here it is, right? Malt, mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. That's what you see there. That's what malt stands for, right? And it's located in the mucous membranes, right, throughout the body. So we find malt in a lot of places. It protects from pathogens trying to enter the body. So malt is found in places where pathogens can enter the body, or we have a higher risk of them, higher incidence of them entering in these places, right? And so where do you find those? This is actually malt, right? These are considered technically malt mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. Believe it or not, tonsils fit that, right? Tonsils are malts themselves, mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. And that's what tonsils are. Why do you have tonsils? Because you have a place, a perfect place, yeah, mouth, right? Perfect place, and nose, by the way, where you could have pathogens enter, right? Not only enter through the air that we breathe, but also enter with the food that we eat and, what we drink, right? What we drink. that area is where you're gonna, you know, put all those things in, and because of which the tonsils there are actually extra uh, nodules, lymphoid nodules that are there to protect that area. Okay, so high areas of potential invasion, right? Peyer's patches. Peyer's patches are like tonsils, if you will, but they're found scattered in the GI tract. That's where Peyer's patches are found, scattered throughout the digestive system, the GI tract. And why is that a really important place to have malt, Peyer's patches? Because that's an area that we take food in, again, drink in, and because those areas might be um, interact with those with that food and drink, well, those are places where we're going to have potential infection or higher risk of infection. And lastly here, the appendix, right? The appendix is actually a small bit of tissue that's found between the end of the small intestine and the beginning of the large intestine in a place we call the cesium. Cesium. Um, it's the beginning of the large intestine. And in that area, there's a small kind of growth of a tissue that we call the appendix. Now, the appendix also has malt, right? A lot of lymphoid tissue there. And we thought the appendix, in fact, was a useless tissue. And in fact, this is actually true. It's left over from evolution, is what we think. We think that that was a growth, an actual bigger portion of our GI tract, one of our larger portion of the small intestine and the large intestine that helped us in digestion when we used to eat raw vegetables, raw fruit, and raw meat. It helped us break those down because that takes an extra amount of energy to actually break those down versus processed food, things that are already cooked. And so this came from the, when we're old nomad hunter and gatherer days. And before that, when we would just eat raw foods and meat. And so that's left over. It's shrunk over time because we actually learned how to, fire and how to cook and how to, take those foods and process them more. And because of that, we didn't need as much, intestine. So we think that's left over. But the important thing now, currently, of what we think the appendix serves as now is a place where we actually train our body on what pathogens we potentially might encounter. So it's training our immune system on the bad things that we should be on the watch for, the immune system. But it also is a place where we're training our immune system on the good things that we have in our body, like the good microorganisms that are located in our body, in our GI tract, like our small intestine and our large intestine. So that's a place where we think our immune system is kind of making sure, oh, okay, these are the good guys. These are the ones that are supposed to be here versus the bad guys. So it's not only because we're training our immune system for the bad things, but also the good things. We also think in the microbial world, talking a little bit about microbiology, in the microbial world, this is kind of where we think our normal microbiota, our normal microorganisms that colonize our area, like the GI tract, where they actually are held in reserve. This is like our reservation area for our microbiota. And when we sometimes strip our microbiota because of many things, but when we strip them, this is a place where those organisms can colonize our GI tract again. So I think it's, that's pretty interesting stuff. But yeah, that's really where the appendix and why the appendix is still around. Okay. So here's our tonsils, right? We actually got three major tonsils, right? The palatine, sorry, four. Palatine, the lingual, and the pharyngeal. And these, why I mentioned three instead of four, is those three are found really in our mouth and in our back of our throats, right? It's kind of our mouth tonsils, if you will, palatine, lingual, and pharyngeal. The tubal tonsils are actually located in the auditory tubes, which is what we call the eustachian tubes. Those are the tubes that connect the middle ear to the actual back of the nose. And those are found right there, those tonsils right there. So not really part of the mouth, they're more part of the back of the nose, but they're still considered part of that area there that we call the respiratory area. That's considered part of the respiratory area. So when we talk about respiratory, in just a little while. When we get into the respiratory system, we revisit tonsils, right? Okay, so tonsils function really is to gather those pathogens in the food or the air and then trap them and then have the immune system work on them to destroy them. Okay, so they're really interesting because they actually have a ton of lymphocytes there, and tonsils. When you look at them, we'll see a picture here, form what we call the tonsillar crypts. So they invaginate. They actually fold. The tissue folds in and forms these little pits or these little divots. And it's perfect for the pathogens that go through our food or the air or water to fall in and get trapped in this kind of, pit, if you will. And this gives the lymphocytes a perfect opportunity to kill them and prevent them from leaving. So it's kind of like a little trap, if you will. Okay, and that's what you see in tonsils. Just looking at these are your tonsillar crypts. I'm going to try to kind of highlight them in yellow here. But you see a tonsillar crypt there. You see a tonsillar crypt there. You see a tonsillar crypt there. Okay, you see a small tonsillar crypt there, and kind of one right here. And there's some other ones there. I mean, we talk about all this right here. But that would be the tonsillar crypts, and then on the outside would be the outside portion of our mouth, right, where the mucous membrane is. We're showing you there the palatine tonsil right there. Okay, there's just a larger view of the palatine tonsil. So as food or air hits the black line, basically, or water, the pathogens, potential pathogens that might be in the food or water or air will fall into these little pits. And this is a perfect place where, again, we trap those pathogens and then we destroy them with our lymphocytes. Really cool stuff. Okay, Peyer's patches, right? Peyer's patches are a collection of the follicles of the lymphoid, right? So collection of cells basically is what that means. And these Peyer patches are then very similar to tonsils, but they destroy bacteria. They prevent those bacteria from getting into the intestinal wall and then into the bloodstream. That's what they prevent. What these Peyer patches do. And then they, very importantly, this is kind of what we see there, right? They generate memory lymphocytes. They memorize, in fact, what particular pathogens they've encountered from, or with presently and in the past, and they memorize them, which is also really awesome to look at, because when we memorize what potential pathogens we've hit before, what we've encountered in our body, we mount a response to them. So if we encounter them again, we know how to destroy them without them starting to cause us harm, which is really awesome to have, especially when you eat different foods. If you eat different things and consume different things or different water, it memorizes those particular pathogens. If you've ever heard of Montezuma's Revenge, I don't know if you've ever heard this before, but we talk about this Montezuma's Revenge and the fact that if you go to a place like Mexico and you go drink the local water from Mexico, you have Montezuma's Revenge. What is that? Severe diarrhea, right? Drinking the water can cause you to kind of, undergo diarrhea for a couple of days until you actually get used to it, right? Get used to the water. And why is this the case? Why can, for example, a person from Mexico, somebody that lives there, somebody that's a resident from there, not can drink the water and not that water cause harm, have diarrhea? Well, it's because their Peyer's patches have recognized that pathogen, know how to memorize what type of pathogen is in the water, and then prevent them from having adverse effects. So the lymphocytes destroy those pathogens as they enter in the blood, so they get used to the water. It's calling getting used to the water. Whereas us, we have never seen that pathogen or specific types of pathogens or the amounts of pathogens, and because of that, our body recognizes it as foreign and then mounts a response called an evacuation, right? This is actually diarrhea. That's what it does, an evacuation of our bowels, because we don't recognize the pathogen. as we go along, if we were to live in Mexico, let's say we stay for several months, we can actually drink the water and it wouldn't cause any harm. Thereby we adjust, or our body adjusts, immune system wise through our Pyrus patches, those pathogens in water. So interesting stuff, right? Okay, so here's our Pyrus patches. Okay, so what we're seeing here is if we take a section of the small intestine, we take that section, we cross-cut it, and we look inside of it. We can see the lumen, right? The little empty space where food and water would go through, right? This is our lumen right here. This area right here. It's kind of where the food and water would go through. Beside it, we've got this little tissue right here, these little microvilli, right? These little villus, little tissue that kind of hangs out here and helps us to absorb stuff. But lying, if we took a square of that, lying this on the side, really the side of wall of the small intestine, you have these Pyrus patches, right? These aggregations of these lymphatic tissue that help when we're interacting with food and water. So you see that there. Okay, the appendix, right? Here's our large intestine, little small tissue of our large intestine. Has a ton of lymphoid follicles, right? Aids in destroying bacteria. But here's our memory lymphocytes. It memorizes, again, as I mentioned, the function there, right? Again, going back to our figure, here's what we see, right? Lymphoid organs, primary and secondary. We're on the secondary, right? Secondary. Okay. Take a look at our thymus, right? It's a bilboid, so it's a two-lobed organ. So it's found in the inferior neck, extends into the mediastinum. Part of it actually overlies the heart, so looking at where the heart is located, the thymus actually touches the heart, overlies the heart. This is where T cells mature, right? This is the maturing T cell area. This is where they kind of go through training, get built up, become mature T lymphocytes, right? So we have the thymus most active in childhood, and it's largest in size, and it kind of atrophies. In fact, our thymus grows big in size, and then it kind of shrinks, in fact. So it stops growing in adolescence, and then it actually atrophies. Still produces the cells, just slower. So when we're a child, the thymus producing a bunch of T lymphocytes. This is our way of actually maturing our whole immune system. And so as a child, you're maturing that. And as you grow older, your thymus is maturing, so it starts to atrophy. And we still do this throughout our life. Okay. This talks about the cortex. Okay. The cortex of our thymus actually has macrophages. This is kind of where we're destroying antigens. And in our medulla, we have what we call thymic corpuscles. Thymic corpuscles. And thymic corpuscles, let me erase this really quick. Thymic corpuscles are where you're going to have regulatory T cells developing. Okay, so the inner portion of the thymus is where you're going to have this regulatory T cells, getting mature, right? All right, so it doesn't have any B cells, does not have follicles. Follicles are usually where you're going to find B cells, and it doesn't have follicles, so it don't have B cells. It doesn't fight antigens per se. It does really just talk about or function as maturing T lymphocytes. It's really what it does, just matures T lymphocytes. It does play a role in fighting off antigens, but it doesn't really directly do that. You have everything else in the lymphatic system doing that, with the exception of the thymus. Thymus is just where you mature your T cells. Okay? And finally, you see there's a figure 2010. There's your thymus overlying the heart. You can see the heart, in this picture right here. There's the thymus in yellow overlying the heart. If you look inside, you've got the same kind of words we use for, for a nodule, for a kidney, for, many organs, the capsule, the cortex, the medulla. So again, those words talk about the location, right? And inside those corpuscles are where the magic happens, right? Where the T cells become mature, right in these kind of circular areas. These are the corpuscles, and you can see many corpuscles there. If you kind of take a look at each one of those are all little different sizes, of course, but here are your corpuscles where the T cells actually mature. Okay, so finally, this last table, I wanted to put this one in here, table 20.1. It's the last slide of this PowerPoint to talk about the 3 or 4 different types of organs and tissues that you find in your body, mainly that make up the lymphatic system. You don't see the vessels there, but here's your tissues, right? Here's your lymph nodes, here's your spleen, here's your mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. You see the GI tract there. You don't see your, the tonsils per se, but you see malt there. There's your thymus. Just to kind of summarize these major lymphoid organs and tissues and their major functions, if they got a capsule, cortex medulla, all those special features, what they do overall, just to kind of summarize where we're at with the last part of the PowerPoint. All right, so I hope this helped you out. I hope this is going to help you out going through the PowerPoint. So again, just to kind of help you through that, since we're not going to have class on Friday, and on Monday and part of Wednesday we'll finish the blood vessels. Hopefully we'll get into some of this, but if not, we at least will get through blood vessels, and kind of you'll have this video to go over during this weekend, whenever the case may be. I will be posting this up pretty soon. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed it. Please give me some feedback on this. If this worked for you, fantastic. If it didn't work, fantastic. I love feedback, so please give me some feedback on this. Let me know if you like these. I'm thinking about kind of continuing this and kind of going through the PowerPoints this way. So just something I'm playing with. So I hope this did help you out. All right, guys. Thank y'all.